Hello, everyone, and welcome to Baseline Tech Talk, where we navigate the evolving nexus of AI, security, and ethics. Today, we're excited to have Raymond join us. He's a digital lawyer, a coder, and one of Australia's 30 under 30 lawyers. As the mind behind the global AI regulation tracker, Raymond has been mapping the shifting landscape of AI governance. In this small talk with big implications, we're dipping into the rising tide of AI nationalism and the contrasting regulatory path between the EU and the US, especially in light of Donald Trump's return to office. Let's dive into how these global powers are setting the stakes for the future of AI and ultimately the future of our digital world.
Thanks, Marybelle, for having me in. Yeah, I'm looking forward to our chat.
Thank you for being with us. Raymond, you've created the Global AI Regulation Tracker, which has quickly become a go to resource for those following AI governance. Can you give us a glimpse into what inspired you to develop this tool and what trends or patterns have surprised you the most?
Yeah, of course. So it's a bit of a backstory, which I'll try and make short, but it started ever since, I was coding throughout high school. I really enjoyed coding as a hobby to build my own games and my own websites. And it's been like a 15-year journey of coding. I'm still coding to this day. And I taught myself machine learning, and we're talking about early 2010s where machine learning was still a relatively new thing, and it was something that I just wanted to look into to one day build my own robots and my own Siri. And as part of that, especially during COVID, I was learning image recognition and also built my own AI that could analyze dance and sport. And so that really propelled me into the field of AI. And we're talking about 2020 and 2021. That was also around the time when the EU AI Act also was first proposed. And that got me into the rabbit hole of reading about AI regulation. Back then, again, AI regulation was kind of more like a thought experiment, more like a hypothetical exercise where you just think about how would we regulate a big field of AI? And I soon found myself just reading a lot into AI regulation. And it's a fascinating area because it cuts across technology, law, geopolitics, history, and culture, which I all really enjoy. And over the past, 4 years, I've been writing my notes in a notebook, and I've been filling up my notebook and also sharing my thoughts and analysis on LinkedIn until I got to the point where I have so much content all over the place that why not I build a website that kind of consolidates all my summaries, all my thoughts on basically every country in the world in terms of AI regulation. And so last year in May, I built my website that basically tracks AI regulations around the world. And it's basically updated every day. And I've been adding new features to it to really help make it into a comprehensive one-stop shop research tool. Yeah. And to answer your last bit around what was the most surprising trend or pattern, I'll put this in one line, which is I'm seeing the globalization of AI ethics and standards, but the deglobalization of AI regulations. And so there's a key distinction between ethics, regulations, and standards. They often get conflated, but they're very, very different. When we talk about ethics, we're really talking about the key values and principles that sort of drive safe and responsible AI. At this point in time in the world, there's pretty much a universal consensus on what those ethics are, including accountability, fairness, human in the loop, stuff like that. And there's United Nations resolutions and documents that really codify these ethics. Regulations is sort of like the layer on top of those ethics to really give that regulatory enforcement. And standards are really your technical slash operational measures to really make the ethics into something more concrete and practical. A lot of the standards today are pretty much universal. We have very reputable standards like the ISO standards, also the IEC standards, and also British standards, Singaporean standards, which very much aligned on this on what is safe and responsible AI. But how these standards are enforced, for example, whether they should always remain voluntary or whether they should have some penalty to them for non-compliance, that's at the regulation level. And I'm sure we'll talk more about this throughout the rest of this session, but there's a lot of different approaches to the regulations, hence why I call it the de-globalization of AI regulations.
That's a fascinating story, Raymond, and it sets the seat perfectly for the next few questions. So let's talk first about the EU governance landscape. The EU AI Act is seen by many as an ambitious, rights based, and risk based model. But with reports from companies like Latticeflow suggesting that no advanced AI model currently meets the Act standards, here's the key question on everyone's mind. Is the AI Act too strict? Is it simply too beautiful to be true? Or are companies not doing enough to comply? And if it's the former, how can the EU ultimately balance regulation and innovation?
Yeah, it's probably one of the top questions of the year, especially since the EA Act recently came to force since August. Um, I think here it's helpful to make a distinction between strict laws versus impractical laws. Strict laws imply a level of reasonableness and practicality, but at an onerous level, compared to impractical laws, which are laws that don't really work in practice, but they're not necessarily strict. So there's that distinction I want to make. Based on the academic material that I've been reading, I think the EA Act often gets criticized more for being impractical rather than being strict. Objectively speaking, if we're talking about strict laws, the EA Act is actually not the strictest standard that we've seen. A strict standard would be the Chinese model, because in the EA Act is predominantly focused on self-assessment and self-registration, but there's no sort of pre-approval requirement. Whereas in China, the Chinese AI laws do require regulatory pre-approval before you can launch a certain AI product into the market. So objectively speaking, the EA Act is not the strictest standard. So the true question is it impractical? And it really depends on who you ask. If you are a small startup starting out building an AI product and you're completely new to GDPR, you're completely new to data compliance, then yeah, sure, the EA Act does add an extra layer of compliance, which can be very daunting and intimidating for small players. And also, um, but the thing is that the EA Act actually has a pretty tight scope. Sure, there is the extraterritorial scope, which we can talk about a bit later, but realistically, most of the compliance burden in the AI Act is focused on providers of high risk systems. That's really most of where the attention is at. You've got systems that are banned, which no one can provide in the first place, so there's no strictness becomes moot at that point. And then you have the rest of the act, which focuses on general purpose models and transparency obligations. Now, the transparency obligations, realistically, they're pretty much just focused on disclosures, watermarking, metadata, which is already happening right now in the market. So it's not really adding anything new. A lot of now comes down to the high risk system obligations and also the general purpose AI models. And a lot of the impractical complaint is really around the EA Act trying to require providers to control or limit things that are considered inherent risks. So, for example, hallucination and bias. Um, Technically, it's impossible to remove any bias or hallucination from an AI system. That's a huge technical challenge. And also, the concept of bias is not just an objective thing, it's also subjective. It's very hard to evaluate bias in the present. You often evaluate that in retrospect. So that's one area where hard coding requirements around bias and hallucination does provide some challenge, and it's also quite vague. And vague and ambiguities are another big sort of criticism of the EA Act, especially as an example, the fine line between providers and deployers in the context of fine tuning. Now, there is a mechanism that says that a deployer can become a provider if they make significant fine tuning, but that sort of concept is still quite vague and still very much subject to clarification. And so the ambiguity is a big aspect of this. And there's a sense of a lot of things, a lot of detail being deferred down the line. So the AI Act provides a lot of high level rich obligations, but the true compliance standards and guidelines are still being developed on a piecemeal basis. So you have first the harmonized standards which are being developed, and that will provide a lot of substance to the act. And on the general purpose AI side, you also have the code of practice, which is being consulted and reviewed right now. So a
Mhm.
lot of the details is still very much to be confirmed, which is adding a lot of uncertainty to the market. Um, that said, though, like there are certain, I guess, counter arguments to the whole idea of the AI Act being impractical or being strict. First of all, there are certain safe harbor clauses in the AI Act. For example, if you're a provider of a high-risk system and you're already working in a regulated industry, particularly, let's say, the financial sector, and you're already complying with those existing financial sector regulations, then you may be deemed to be already be compliant with some of the quality and risk management obligations under the AI Act. So the AI Act does contemplate overlapping obligations which can benefit from deemed compliance clauses. There's also the grace period where it takes for the high risk AI systems 2 years to take into effect, and those who already have existing laws are a 3 year grace period. But practically speaking, the grace period is really 6 years because the EA Act was proposed in 2021. And so in that time, there was already awareness within the market that this law is coming. And so I also would count that as part of the grace period. So there's a long preparation period. And also throughout this period, AI safety has really become more from an abstract into a practical concept. The whole idea of safety by design or responsible AI by design. At this point in the market, there's a lot of good guidelines, a lot of good practices around that. So by the time these high risk obligations come to effect in 2026 or 2027, a lot of the existing practices will pretty much be matched up with the AI Act. And also, AI compliance programs are getting more popular. There's a lot of software, a lot of toolkits to help you operationalize compliance through code. So I think in the future, right now, it might be considered strict or impractical, but later it'll be pretty smooth. Yeah.
Thank you. So, speaking about the impact of the EU AI Act, this ties into a broader question I've been wanting to ask. So, there's a lot of buzz around the Brussels effect, where EU regulation like GDPR have set global standards. And with the rise of AI nationalism, do you think the AI Act will carry that same weight on the world stage? And in your opinion, is this poised to be another GDPR style wave, or are we looking at something entirely different where nations diverge rather than align?
Yeah, I love this sort of question because it really gets into the nuance of things. So, first of all, it depends on how you define Brussels effect. If you're defining Brussels effect as solely as a reference to the extraterritorial application of the EA Act, similar to how it was for the GDPR, then sure, yeah, the A Act will have a Brussels effect by requiring compliance of overseas stakeholders. But if we're defining Brussels effect in terms of in terms of whether the AI Act will inspire similar approaches and models around the world, then I think that's a very different story. There's a key distinction between the AI Act and the risk-based approach because these often get conflated. The EA Act is an example of a risk-based approach. So basically regulating AI systems by the risk level. But the AI Act is not the only example of the risk-based approach. The current data that I'm seeing suggests that the risk-based approach is the most popular approach for AI regulation, but the actual EA Act example is not that popular. And some examples I like to cite are South Korea, Japan, and Brazil, and also Canada. They've got their own version of the AI Act, where they are mostly still in draft form, and they follow the risk-based approach. But when you compare it line by line, concept by concept to the EA Act, these other jurisdictions have a much more a less strict approach and also less onerous approach than the EU Act. So, and this sort of differences is due to many reasons. You already mentioned AI nationalism, which, for context, is more of an advanced form of AI sovereignty. AI sovereignty being when a country wants to prioritize their local AI industry. AI nationalism is sort of that, but also trying to limit trade and trying to limit imports of AI services, and they just want to prioritize production and their own exports. And we're seeing that a lot given current geopolitical tensions. COVID brought a lot of shock as well because COVID made us realize that the global supply chain is actually very vulnerable. So we gotta back up our own local industries. So that's a huge thing that's happening. Um, in terms of the actual regional impact of the EA Act, it's also quite interesting. So we need to remember that the European Union is a collection of 27, I think, states. It's not one country. And if you've been following the actual negotiation process of the EA Act, the version that we see today is very different from the version that we first saw in 2021. And there was a lot of division amongst the European nations on how the rules should be crafted. One of the big examples was when France, Germany, and Italy threatened to jeopardize the entire negotiations over the general purpose AI rules, and they were planning to create their own voluntary code of conduct on that. So the EA Act is a middle ground of all European nations' interests. So that's interesting to note. And if you look at the history of the GDPR enforcement, it's likely that the enforcement practices of the EA Act will mostly be dominated by Irish and Italian practices, given that the Italian and Irish data protection authorities have been the most active in GDPR enforcement. So I'm expecting that might be the same for the AI Act. Perhaps France will be a new player in this field because France does house a lot of powerful big AI companies. But it goes to show that the act, the actual legislation itself is one thing, but the enforcement practice tells a very different story. And it all comes down to resourcing and the like. And this kind of goes back to the first question. Like, not all, even if the act is considered strict, not all forms of non-compliance will be actioned or pursued. We're really talking about non-compliances from big tech companies or the big AI developers. And so that's likely going to be the trend that I'm seeing the AI Act play out. And just on the final point on the comparison to the GDPR, like AI is very different from privacy. Privacy is it's a more defined construct. It's really just about personal data, which is a bit more of a straightforward exercise. There's less scope for you to sort of think about. Whereas AI is multifaceted. It cuts across so many angles. It's subject to a lot more economic and geopolitics. Hence why it's subject to a lot more different regulatory approaches compared to, let's say, the GDPR, where it was really just making sure data was secure, safe, and consensual. So that's what I think.
I think our listeners will definitely appreciate this food for thought about the UAI Act. But for our last question, let's shift gears and talk about the US AI landscape. With Trump set to return to office, the world is kind of waiting to see how his administration will approach AI regulation. You recently noted in one of your posts that broader structural factors play a bigger role than the presidency alone. Can you expand on that and tell us where you see AI policy headed in the US?
Yeah, of course. So I'll probably just add some context as to why many commentators think the Trump administration will have a very different approach to AI regulation. It's mo Most of the commentators refer to the Republican Party's manifesto that was circulated during the election, where they, among many other policy initiatives, they vowed to sort of repeal President Biden's existing executive order on AI safety. And so that order required all the federal agencies to launch a bunch of policies and initiatives in responsible AI. So the Republican Party's manifesto said they want to repeal that executive order and they want AI innovation to quote unquote flourish, whatever that means. And also recent appointments by President-elect Trump. For example, he recently appointed a AI and crypto czar as a way to sort of drive the AI agenda in the US. The exact policy agenda is still to be confirmed, but these sort of developments are what are indicating to the market that the Trump administration might have a much more relaxed approach to AI regulation and that things will change a lot. But if for those who like, as a disclaimer, I'm not based in the US, I'm based in Australia, so I also don't practice law in the US, so this is purely based on my analysis of US legal system and also just talking to people based on the US. We need to remember like there are like I say six key structural factors to think about that sort of go beyond the presidency. The first one is the separation of powers. So the separation between executive, legislature, and judiciary. The president falls within the executive sphere, but that's only one third of the powers that's in the US. So the president itself can't do everything. It's still checked and balanced by the other two bodies. So that's more of a fundamental thing. So building on top of that is the division of powers. The division of powers is probably the more overlooked point. Um, the the division of powers basically there are responsibilities divided between the state and the federal level. The president is at the federal level, but the federal can't regulate every aspect. For example, the federal government can regulate, defense, foreign policy, interstate commerce. But when it comes to, let's say, education, public health, criminal justice, that's still very much on a state by state level. And one of the complicating factors of the US is that it's got like 50 states and every state's doing their own thing. So it's really hard to find alignment. What the federal government can do is provide some sort of backbone framework that the states can then draw upon as inspiration to align. But given the distribution of economic resources across the US, it's unlikely we'll see true alignment, and there'll likely be concentration of regulatory power and weight across certain states, for example, California, New York, Massachusetts, etc. So that's the second key structural factor. The third big factor is in the Constitution, which is the free speech protection. The US is one of the very few countries that actually expressly protects free speech in their constitution, and that has a big impact on digital regulation in general. Any law that seeks to control content or control things that produce content, including generative AI, you have to consider whether that cuts across the constitutional protection of free speech. And if you look at all the existing draft bills on deep fakes or synthetic content or um, personality rights in the generative AI sphere, all of these bills have some clause that says subject to whatever is the free speech protection, and there are certain carve-outs to that. So that will always be in place regardless of who the president is. Another key structural factor is um, the president's so the whole idea of the president being able to repeal the existing executive order, that might be true. And sure, the president does have power over federal agencies, but that power is also limited. For example, the president can't direct agencies to act contrary to law. Agencies also maintain a level of statutory independence. So, and so even if Trump repeals Biden's executive order, a lot of the existing agency guidelines and initiatives, such as the NIST AI risk framework, are already out in public and they're likely here to stay, regardless of who the president is. And they're unlikely going to be taken back because a lot of companies and market are already adopting these practices. So there's that sort of limitation. Also, a lot of the AI regulations that we're seeing, there's a lot of bipartisan support behind it. It's a so bipartisan activity will likely continue. The Democrats, Republicans will still continue proposing their own AI bills. I think what is changed a bit is that the Republican Party does control all layers of the Congress. So Republican led AI bills do have a better chance in the Trump administration compared to what we have right now. But the nature of US politics is that a lot of these bills are proposed by individual senators or individual House of Representatives, often on the individual basis without necessarily a united party front. And these bills are often going to be pushed out towards the later years of the term where elections coming up and each politician wants to be able to show to their base that they're doing something. So I expect that sort of political factor will still stay the same regardless of who the president is. And also finally, this is probably more technical point, but there's the recent overturn of the Chevron doctrine. So for many years, there's this doctrine called the Chevron doctrine, which basically states that whenever a U.S. court is interpreting like a law, they need, or sorry, a agency guideline or program, you need to leave any ambiguity should be left to the relevant federal agency to interpret. And that sort of gave a lot of power to the executive body to be able to interpret their laws. But that doctrine, which lasted for 40 years, has been recently overturned in Loper Bright Enterprises and Raymond case, which basically gave power back to the courts to be able to make that interpretation. And so this kind of goes back to the first point on the separation of powers. The separation of powers has been reinforced a bit further since that overturn. And so to summarize, there are a lot of structural factors that kind of control and curtail the lawmaking powers and the enforcement powers of the presidency. And so regardless of who comes in, I expect the current trend to really continue. I think the trend in the US will continue to focus a lot more on deep fakes because that really hits quite hard at the American audience. It's also easier to sort of get support, bipartisan support behind it. And also national security, given the whole geopolitical tensions and a lot more focus on trying to reinforce American innovation and competitiveness in AI. So yeah, quite a long answer, but hopefully that covers the field.
So yeah, one conclusion is probably that previous initiatives would have already left a footprint on the digital landscape. So
That's
I
right. That's a
guess
that's a good summary. Yeah.
Raymond, your insights today have truly shed light on the complexities of AI governance and the road ahead, whether it's EU's ambitious framework or the structural challenges shaping US policy. It's clear we're navigating a pivotal moment for AI's global future. And that brings us to the end of today's conversation on Baseline Tech Talk. A huge thank you to Raymond Sun for sharing his insights on the evolving landscape of AI governance. From Brussels to Silicon Valley, the potential ripple effect of the EU AI Act and the challenges posed by AI nationalism highlight that the future of AI regulation is anything but simple. Stay tuned as we continue to unpack the key forces shaping AI's role in today's world, right here where technology meets ethics and security. Thanks for listening, and until next time, this is Marybelle Cherfan signing off.